I'm Abe Kronsberg, a member of the Board of Trustees of the Jewish Museum of Maryland. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual presentation today, Reform Judaism in Baltimore and Charleston, at the forefront of modernity and change with Dr. Mark Bauman. I am particularly pleased to introduce this program, both as a native Charlestonian and as a Baltimorean for more than 50 years. As always, before we get started, we'll do a little housekeeping. Live captioning is available throughout today's program using Zoom's automated captioning feature. To view the captions, click the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitle. If you have questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A feature, also at the bottom of the screen. We will do our best to answer all of your questions following the presentation. For those of you joining us on Facebook, please submit your questions in the comment field. Our tech team will pass them along to our speaker. At the end, or upon leaving the presentation, you will automatically be redirected to a survey about your experience. If you can please take a couple of minutes to share your thoughts, it will help us learn from this program and take those lessons into our work. Next, I have a very exciting announcement for our members. The museum is preparing for a limited reopening of the current exhibit, Jews in Space, Members of the Tribe in Orbit, before it blasts off to its next destination. From April 22nd until June 10th, we are offering all JMM members a chance to reserve advance tickets for designated time slots to visit the museum with up to 6 of their guests. You can find out more information about reserving tickets via the link in chat. If you're not yet a museum member and would like to join to support our work and for a chance to see the exhibit before it closes, you can find out how to do so via the other link in chat. Today, we are pleased to continue our series of programs inspired by the 175th anniversary of the Lloyd Street Synagogue here in Baltimore. If you would like to revisit previous programs in this series, you can find recordings on our website using the link in chat. For those of you joining us from further afield, we will be offering on April 20th our first virtual opportunity to experience the Lloyd Street Synagogue with our new digital tour. We are putting one last link in the chat now so you can register today. Today's speaker, Dr. Mark Bauman, is a retired professor of history at Atlanta Metropolitan College. He has studied and written about Southern Jewish history for over 4 decades. He has edited Southern Jewish History, the annual peer-reviewed journal of the Southern Jewish Historical Society, since its inception in 1998. He holds a doctorate from Emory University and has taught at the College of William and Mary as a Mason Fellow. He is the author of A New Vision of Southern Jewish History and numerous other works. Dr. Bauman, over to you.
Thanks so much, Abe, and thank you, Trillian and Laura, for inviting me here. We're going to start this program going all the way back to Europe. In the late 1700s, you had the European Enlightenment. And one of the things the Enlightenment thinkers did was trying to discuss and solve what they called the Jewish problem. And these Enlightenment thinkers included people like John Locke. What was the Jewish problem? The Jewish problem was that Jews and Judaism continued to exist, that the policies of ghettoization and discrimination had not eliminated Jews over the last 2 centuries. The solution the Enlightenment offered was that instead of ghettoizing Jews, Jews would now be allowed into secular culture. And the assumption was, once they were assimilated into secular culture, they would convert and Judaism would be no more. As a result, first Austria emancipated its Jews, and then France emancipated its Jews. The net result of this was the gradual secularization of some aspects of Judaism. So you have the beginnings of reform in England and in Holland and other European countries. In Germany, it was slightly different. Germany believed that as a prerequisite, now this is the German states, Germany doesn't exist as a unified country until around 1870 when it's unified. All right, the German solution was that first the Jews would secularize. They would have to earn their citizenship and other rights. And this delays things and changes things dramatically. But reform starts in the German states in around 1817 with the Hamburg Temple being founded. The Hamburg Temple was one of the first Reform synagogues in the German states. And it becomes very, very important for our story because the Hamburg Temple influences reform in both Charleston and in Baltimore. So what you're seeing is the European background of what happens in America. From here, we're going to shift over to Charleston. First off, the Jewish community of South Carolina goes back to an individual in the 1600s, but really in the early 1700s. A congregation is established in the mid 1700s, KK Beth Elohim. Okay, now what happens is by the 1820s, the scions of some of the original settlers have become very secularized in society. Now, a group of young men petition KKBE's board, and they say, we would like reforms. What were the nature of the reforms? We would like more English, more translations. We would like more decorum in services so that each person isn't just speaking out the prayers as they go along. We want fewer prayers. We want shorter services. We want less repetition of prayers, things like that. They also stressed that this was their country. So they reject, and we're going to see this with Baltimore as well, the concept of diaspora. They essentially say, we are not looking for next year in Jerusalem. This is our happy land. This is our Jerusalem. Well, the board of KKBE refuses the reforms. So this group of men separate and form in the mid-1820s the Reform Society of Israelites. This is the first Reform congregation in the United States. Now, they have troubles, but they do a lot of things. One of the things they do is they have the first Reform prayer book in the world. Now, actually, there are different editions of this that Gary Zola has done research on. In these Reform prayer books, what they tended to emphasize was actually the roles of women. And a lot of the reforms were geared towards having their sisters and their mothers and their wives being a greater part of the service. For example, mixed seating, sermons that they could understand, things like that. Well, the Reform Society essentially dies out by the mid to late 1830s. Now, a little bit about Charleston. It's hard to realize, but between 1800 and 1830, Charleston had the largest Jewish community in the United States, something like 750 Jews. It was far larger than that place up north. I think they call it New York. In any case, by 1830, Charleston starts to decline economically. And this has a major impact because many of the reform leaders are young, upwardly mobile individuals. Many of them leave. Isaac Harvey winds up going to New York. Moisey family members, Chaim family members, Benjamin family members wind up going across country, especially to New Orleans. So they become very mobile. As they become mobile, they wind up taking reform with them. But those who do remain become part of KKBE again. And you have a new rabbi, really a minister, he's not an ordained rabbi, Gustavus Poznansky, who becomes the new spiritual leader of KKBE. Gustavus Poznansky has something that is very, very good for a rabbi. He's got a wife that has sufficient sums, money, so that he is not dependent upon the congregation for financing. As a result, he can act relatively independently. When the issue comes up of having an organ in services, he comes down in favor of this, which is considered a major reform. There are court cases involved. The congregation winds up splitting once and splitting again. But essentially, Gustavus Poznansky winds up taking KKBE, the original congregation, into the camp of reform. Okay, from Charleston, we're now going to switch over to Baltimore. Oh, one other thing. A key book on Reform Judaism was by the late historian Leon Jick of Brandeis University. He called it The Americanization of Judaism, and he used Charleston as an example of Americanization. What you're going to see in my presentation is a variation of that and a questioning of that. Yes, these people took the local churches as part of their examples. Yes, these people were highly Americanized, but they also looked to the Hamburg Temple and other European Reform congregations for leadership and guidance. Okay, Baltimore. As many of you know, in 1826, the Baltimore legislature finally gives Jews full political rights with the Maryland Jew Bill, as it was called. In 1830, the first congregation in Baltimore is established. It's called Neche Israel, which is the scattered of Israel, the Baltimore Hebrew congregation, and I think most of you know it better as the Lloyd Street congregation, as it's later known. Okay, the congregation is established in 1830. It is used to doing business on its own without paid professional leadership. In 1840, it brings over from Europe a man named Abraham Rice. Abraham Rice is the first ordained rabbi to hold an American pulpit. Rice came from the German states, as did most of the members of the congregation. Rice was not in favor of reform. He was a traditionalist, okay? Now, what happens is the members of of Baltimore Hebrew had gotten used to laxity in terms of Jewish practice. Many of them conducted business on the Shabbat. Now, when Rice becomes rabbi, he says, if you break the Sabbath and you're called for an aliyah to give a prayer in the services, the congregation will not respond with amen, because it's not really a kosher prayer, since you are not kosher. Obviously, he was not the favorite of many of these members. But the real turn came in 1842, 2 years after his arrival. One of the charter members of the congregation, who originally came from Holland, passed away. The man's name was Jacob Aarons, or Aaron. It's spelled different ways. At Jacob Aaron's funeral, Abraham Rice presided, but you had Odd Fellows and Masons also doing part of the ceremony. Rabbi Rice went ballistic. He said, these are Goyish or non-Jewish Gentile ceremonies, and they do not belong in a Jewish cemetery service. So what happens is, he says in the future, he will not preside over a funeral if you have Masonic or Oddfellow rites. Many of Jacob Aaron's supporters totally dislike this, and they wind up leaving Baltimore Hebrew congregation, and they found the first long-term Reform congregation in the United States. It is called Har Sinai Verein. Now notice it's not called a temple, it's not called a synagogue, it's called a Verein, a society, because that's the way they perceived it. They were a group of people in society. Okay, now what happens here is that these people have spiritual leaders who are non-paid and they are not ordained. The key spiritual leaders at the beginning were two readers. One was a man named Joseph Simpson, and the other was Abraham Wachtman. They also had two lecturers. One was Max Sutro, and the other was Moritz Brown. These people are very important for our story. Now, these people had occupations other than their functions in the congregation, because they believed you should not make a living by the Torah or by being a Jewish functionary. This was an honor and not an occupation. Okay, now, Baltimore Hebrew refuses to give Har Sinai prayer books or the use of a Torah or anything else. So the members of Har Sinai, most of whom are relatively young, mid-20 was the average age, except for 3 that were in the 50s, go to the Hamburg Temple. They don't go, they write to the Hamburg Temple. They ask for prayer books and sermons and anything else that God told Solomon and Kli would send to them. Kli and Solomon send them sermons and prayer books. And this is what starts them off. They have their services, and the following year in 1843, they incorporate as a congregation. Okay, at this stage, I'm going to have to go into something called historiography. Historiography is the study of different historical interpretations, what historians view history. Most historians of reform in America maintain that this is not true reform. If you look at the practices at Har Sinai or KK Beth Elohim, you see what can be considered like very minor reforms. They still had Hebrew, they still wore yarmulkes, they still separated men from women and things like that. So as far as these people were concerned, real reform does not take place until the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, when you have a group of reform rabbis brought over from Europe who formulate a theory behind reform, all right? The theoretical framework for reform. I dramatically differ from these historians. If you look at the theories described by the leaders of KK Beth Elohim, and especially the leaders of Har Sinai Verein, they had a theory of reform. And the theory of reform was very, very reasonable. What they did was reject the authority of rabbis. As far as they were concerned, a rabbi had no more authority than a layperson. It was up to each individual to choose which practice to observe and which practice not to observe. Now, this came through in 2 directions. It is called anti-rabbinism, anti-rabbi authority. Anti-rabbinism meant that they rejected the authority of the Talmud. They said the Talmud was fine for ancient times. It suited the ancient times. Now we're in the present. It should be a living Judaism suited to the needs of our country, our place, our time now. So as far as they were concerned, you don't subscribe to the authority of the Talmud. You have a living Judaism, you look at the Bible, and you interpret it for everyday life today. And it was not up to the congregation, it was not up to the rabbi, it was up to the individual choice. Now, this is a rejection of the authority of the Talmud, but it also meant the rejection of the authority of the rabbis in their time period. And this is the way they went against Abraham Rice. They said, your authority is no bigger than any of the congregants. It's not up to you to interpret for us. It's up to us to interpret ourselves. Now, an example of this is very curious. It's one of the first readers, Joseph Simpson. Joseph Simpson was a Talmudic scholar. He had been trained, although he had not reached Semicha, he had not been an ordained rabbi. He came from a family of Talmudic scholars. He was highly traditionalist, all right? But he's the reader for Har Sinai. Now, in his obituaries, it becomes very interesting. It says, this is a man totally dedicated to the Talmud and Jewish practices. He was an Orthodox Jew in practice, but he was liberal in his understanding of it, which meant these practices were fine for him, but they were not necessarily good for someone else. If you want different practices, if you want to have your business open on Shabbat, if you want to keep kosher or not keep kosher, that is your individual choice. And that was the key to this. This was the philosophy of Reform Judaism. It was individual choice. Now, one of the things that these people reject is the concept of diaspora, of living in exile. Now, this comes out clearly. I want to check briefly. All right, I believe, Max Sutro, one of the readers in 1845, it was the 9th of Ab. The 9th of Ab commemorated, it was a day of fast commemorating the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem 1700 years before this. And he said, why are we bothering to do this almost 2,000 years later? Next year is not in Jerusalem, next year is in Baltimore. As Poznansky and Isaac Harvey said for Charleston, this is our happy land. Now, if you realize the impetus of this, this becomes the beginning of the rejection of the concept of the Jewish state in Israel for the Reform movement. The idea was, wherever you're living, you're not in the diaspora, make the best of it. You do not have to go back to Israel, some sort of ancient history of Israel or a new state of Israel, to be a good Jew. So one of the aspects of what becomes classical Reform Judaism is a rejection of the idea of political Zionism. And this is where you see the beginnings of this going all the way back into the 1820s, 30s, and 1840s. It's not something that begins with the Pittsburgh Platform or classical reform. Okay, we continue on with this. In 1850, the congregation finally hires an ordained rabbi. He was a radical rabbi from the German states who could not hold a pulpit there because of his radical reform ideas. The man's name was David Einhorn. David Einhorn comes to Baltimore and the congregation had not done an awful lot of formal reforms. When Einhorn comes, it's like the congregation was ready to formulate the typical reforms. No yarmulkes, sermon now in German. He spoke in German. He didn't like English or Hebrew. Separate, no more separate seating, no tallis, no yarmulke. All of those things are promulgated under David Einhorn. He becomes the leader of what becomes known as radical reform. Now, you've all heard of Isaac Abraham Weiss. Weiss was the leader of the moderate reform element, Einhorn of the radical reform, classical reform movement. Now, a couple of things happen here. Weiss and Isaac Leeser was the traditionalist leader of American Judaism. He was a rabbi, not a rabbi, a minister. Again, he wasn't ordained in Philadelphia. Both Weiss and Leeser had this image of a unified American Judaism. They wanted to bring the congregations and usage together. And they did this. Both of them start seminaries, train rabbis. Both of them hold a series of conferences, trying to gather the congregations and make sense out of division, where each congregation, each individual was doing their own thing. In 1841, Weiss and Leeser plan a conference in Philadelphia. In 1855, they plan an additional conference in Cleveland. Baltimore Hebrew and KKBE get together and reject both conferences. They say all this is doing is trying to create a rabbinical authority over the individual congregations and over individuals. They refuse to participate and say these unifying efforts are absolutely wrong. Now, what happens at the Philadelphia and Cleveland conferences? Weiss, moderate reformer, and Leeser, the traditionalist, stress the Talmud. They stress tradition. They say, yeah, you can change certain things. You could have sermons for edification. You can have more decorum in the services, but we must maintain the Talmud as a sacred document. This is perfectly against the thinking of the philosophy of both Har Sinai Barain and KKBE, and this is why they reject it. Now, in everything they do at Har Sinai Barain, David Einhorn gets the approval of his board and his congregation. Where he promulgates reform, he gets the approval of the congregation. Where he rejects these conferences, he gets the approval of the board and the congregation. We jump ahead to 1860, 1861. Many of you know this is the beginning of the war between the states. David Einhorn is a rabid abolitionist. He's a leader of abolition at a time where most Jews, most rabbis in America do not stand out as abolitionists. Baltimore and Maryland were essentially border areas. Baltimore and Maryland did have slavery. It would have been very easy for Maryland to join the Confederacy. So in essence, Einhorn's opinions were very, very controversial where he was. He published a newspaper, as many of these rabbis did, to get prestige, to get his opinion out. The newspaper was destroyed by a mob. He was threatened and he was forced to leave the city. When order was basically restored, he and the congregation agreed that he could return. but the congregation established guidelines. They said, for your safety and for the safety of the congregation, you cannot speak out openly in favor of abolition of slavery. Einhorn rejected this qualification. He leaves Baltimore and becomes the rabbi of the historic congregation in Philadelphia. I think this story is extremely important for our understanding of the philosophy of reform and the way Einhorn was the leader of reform, but then changes it. As far as the congregation was concerned, they had the authority over the rabbi. The rabbi was not an independent individual. As far as the rabbi was concerned, he was in favor of an independent, free speech rabbinate, which was against the idea that the congregants, not the rabbi, was in control. This goes further. In 1869, there is another conference, and Einhorn is a major participant in this conference. In this conference, they try to promulgate the basics of classical Reform Judaism. You see, as far as Einhorn was concerned, yes, reform was a matter of personal opinion, but his personal opinion was more important than everyone else's personal opinion. So as far as he was concerned, there was only one branch of Judaism that was appropriate. There was only one branch of reform that was appropriate. And that was his interpretation, radical classical reform. So what you see here is that from my perspective, from the perspective of the people that established reform in America, it was a lay-led movement. Now, this goes further. In 1885, a group of Reform rabbis, led by two of Einhorn's son-in-laws, meet at Pittsburgh and establish the Pittsburgh Platform. The Pittsburgh Platform, even though the majority of congregations don't support it at the time, becomes the basis of classical reform for the next generations until, let's say, the 1930s, okay? It rejects the concept of return to Israel, political, of a new nation state in Israel. It stresses ethical reform, essentially Jewish social gospel. So the essence of Judaism now is going to be ethical reform teachings, a universalist brotherhood, a universalist humanism. Okay, as far as the original reform leaders were concerned, this would have been very, very negative, because what it was doing was defining acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Whereas as far as they were concerned, if you wanted to practice tradition or you did not want to practice tradition, that was only up to the individual. Okay, now what you're seeing here is a mixture. You're seeing the European background dramatically influencing reform in America. So was reform in America a process of Americanization? I'm going to suggest reform in America was not a process of Americanization. It was more likely a process of modernization that went beyond the Atlantic Ocean. It was a transcontinental process. Okay, so what does this mean? If you look at the leaders of the Reformed Society of Israelites, they were Americanized. If you look at the leaders of Har Sinai variety, they were largely recent immigrants from the German states. They were less acculturated and Americanized than the leaders of Baltimore Hebrew congregation. The leaders of Baltimore Hebrew tended to be more traditional, but also more established in America. The leaders of Har Sinai were more reformed, but they had brought reform with them from Europe. So what you're seeing here is this broad process, a transatlantic process of secularization and modernization led by, not the rabbis, but led by the lay people. Now, part of this, you've got to remember, is that there was no ordained rabbi in America until 1840. There were learned religious functionaries, but they did not have the power and authority of an ordained rabbi before Abraham Rice. People in America had gotten used to not having rabbinical authority, and this was part of the result. But when you compare it to Europe, you realize it's also the process of secularization going on in Europe as well. And this is why we say it's a transcontinental process of modernization and secularization. Did reform cause Jews not to follow tradition? No. The Jews were gradually getting away from tradition, and that's what led to reform. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bauman, for that wonderful presentation that I think reframed a lot of thinking around this topic. So I'm Laura Grant. I'm the program assistant here at the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and I'm going to lead us into the Q&A section of today's program. So I think we have one question at the moment. Is there any evidence of exchanges of ideas between the leadership of KK Beth Elohim and Har Sinai?
Absolutely. At one stage, Max Sutro, with that instance with the 9th of Ab, he actually contacted Gustavus Poznansky for his opinion. And when they rejected these conferences, the people between KKBE and Har Sinai were coordinating and corresponding. They were aware of what each other was doing. So there was very close communication between the two congregations. They realized they were the pioneers of reform in America.
And kind of this question follows along from that. Was there communication between KKB and those in Hamburg or other German reformers?
The historians of reform in Charleston are very vague with this. There are brief references that they were in touch with and modeled themselves on Hamburg and another congregation in Germany and some other places in Europe. I think the contact was much more thorough than that. I think they were fully aware of what was happening in the German states, and I think that was used partly as a model.
Someone is wondering if you can speak a bit about the role of music in early Reform congregations.
Very, very important. In fact, one of the things I forgot to say that I wanted to is that first, the Reformed Society of Israelites and then KKBE were very concerned with hymns because they wanted the service to be something that their Christian friends could go to and enjoy. So they developed a hymnal, and the first American Jewish poetess, Penina Moise, writes a series of hymns that go into this. So music is very important. It also emphasizes the role of women in this. And following through with this, and obviously I mentioned before the role of organs. The use of organs was a dramatic change from tradition. And that was the last straw with KKBE and leading to a splinter where the more Orthodox separated from KKBE. So the choir, they had mixed choirs, the hymns, the organs were all very, very important to this story. One of the things you got to realize is that in Europe, the men tended to be the key to the congregation. In America, the men were not the keys to the congregation. They were the power, they were the leaders. Membership was counted by the men, but the men were deeply involved in business. So what you have is what I call the feminization of American Judaism. Women participate a whole lot. Women dominate teaching the children in the Sunday schools. And this starts with Rebecca Gratz in Philadelphia, but she's got a niece in Baltimore, in Charleston, that becomes the second Jewish Sabbath school in Charleston. So all of these things go hand in hand with this. So it's really fascinating stories.
And the original questioner added, maybe if you can speak a little bit more about specifically Posnitzky's role in the organ controversy and Laura Weinman's role with the choir, speaking about the music. Are you familiar with?
Frankly, it looks like the questioner should be telling me about Laura Wyman. I'm not familiar with her. In terms of the organ controversy, the congregation, I think the building had burned down. And when they're rebuilding, they discuss the issue of the organ. And the board and the congregation is extremely divided over this, and it leads to a court case. It goes to the secular courts, which is really surprising because it really should have been dealt with a bet din, a rabbinic court, but you didn't have the rabbinic authorities in America. And the court essentially wipes its hands and says, hey, this is up to you. As far as the courts, the secular society is concerned, if you want an organ, you can. So the organ case becomes a pivotal case, even in terms of law, in terms of the role of the courts, in terms of Judaism and Jewish congregations, and what could happen and who would gain possession, and et cetera. In terms of Laura Wyman, I am open to be enlightened if the questioner would actually share the information with the group.
Maybe they can put a note in the Q&A or in chat for those wanting to learn a bit more about that story. So now there's a couple questions sort of speaking beyond Baltimore and Charleston. So, and maybe speaking a bit about the like larger interactions as well. So someone writes, as a conservative Baltimorean, I'd understood the first Reform congregation was located in Rhode Island. What interactions occurred between them, if any?
The first Reform congregation was not located in Rhode Island. The Toro Synagogue was traditional, it was Sephardic. So that information was wrong. In terms of interaction, I'm trying to think, and I don't think of interaction between Baltimore and Rhode Island, and there's a reason for this. In the colonial period, there were 5 congregations. You had one in Newport, Rhode Island, you had one in New York, you had one in Philadelphia, the one in Charleston, and one in Savannah. And I want you to realize that's 2 out of 5 in the South. Rhode Island had been a major Jewish community in the colonial period, but Rhode Island had a lot of trade with England. And during the American Revolution, the Rhode Island economy was essentially shot. So what happens is the Newport congregation, after the American Revolution, essentially dies out, and it doesn't really get recomposed for several decades later. But Rhode Island was not a Reformed congregation. It was Sephardic traditional. And even after it was reestablished, it was Sephardic traditional.
I just want to add quickly that Dale contributed that Wyman, going back to the music specific question, Wyman led the KKBE choir after the Civil War and came in conflict with the trustees about which hymns to sing. Her husband was the congregation's president, which may have emboldened her. And then he notes that Jenna W. Jostlett is looking into the details. So thank you, Dale, for providing us with that context for your question.
Thanks, Dale. Welcome. Okay. There's something else before you get into question, and that is the impact of these congregations elsewhere.
Mhm.
And I think that's very important. As I indicated with Charleston, a lot of the members were young people in their 20s and 30s. When Charleston declines economically, many of those people leave. And when they leave, they go across country, whether it to be Columbia, South Carolina, then in Alabama and Mobile, and then in New Orleans, and some of them even find themselves in California with the gold rush. As they go across the country, they bring reform with them. And that's very significant. Baltimore is a slightly different case because Baltimore's economy after 1830 continues to be very, very, very prosperous. I could go into urban history and the development of canals and the railroads and things like that, but Baltimore continues to flourish. As a result, most of the leaders of Har Sinai remain in Baltimore. I know of only one or two that wind up in Cincinnati, but most of them stay in Baltimore. But one of the curious aspects of this is the Dyer family. The Dyer family were active members and charter members of Baltimore Hebrew congregation, the Lloyd Street congregation. The leader of this family is actually considered the first regular butcher, not butcher, an abattoir, a meat packing plant, essentially. Now, he was actually originally a Nachman. He changed his name on the way over for some reason that I'm not sure of. But what's curious is two of his sons wind up leaving, and one of his daughters winds up leaving. Now, one of the sons, let me see if I've got the name. I think it's Joseph Dyer. Is it Joseph Dyer? I don't want to get my facts screwed up, and I know I have this. No, Leon Dyer. Leon Dyer, John Dyer's son, is the president of Baltimore Hebrew when Har Sinai separates. He's the president for about a decade. But what's curious, though, is that his family members wind up leaving. So you've got Leon Dyer going from Baltimore. He was a military leader, so he gets involved in the Mexican War and things like that. He goes from Baltimore to New Orleans to San Francisco. Even though the family was traditional in Baltimore, he helps establish the first Reformed congregation in San Francisco. Okay. Isidore and Rosanna Dyer Oosterman go to Galveston, Texas. They establish Reform in Galveston, Texas. So what you're seeing is Reform is not limited to these congregations. These congregations, even the traditional elements, become the seedbed of Reform going across the country as the country moves west, as Jews move west from the East Coast.
Thank you. And continuing on that theme of sort of the reform movement across the United States, someone specifically is wondering about Cincinnati. How does Cincinnati fit in the development of Reform Judaism?
Obviously, Cincinnati becomes the major center of Reform because of Isaac Mayer Weiss. But I will mention that Weiss is dramatically influenced by the lay members of his congregation who tend to push and support his institutional developments. So Weiss develops, obviously, Hebrew Union College, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the Central Conference of American Rabbis. But I want everyone to think about those names. Reform is not mentioned in any one of them. Because as I said, Weiss, Leeser, Einhorn all had this image that they were going to be the unifying forces. All right. Weiss hoped and expected that Hebrew Union College would be just that. It would be a center for this seminary to train rabbis for all of the congregations in America, not just the moderate Reform congregations. And it was wrong with that, because ultimately you have Orthodox splitting off for various different reasons, and ultimately then you have conservatives splitting off still again, largely at the beginning of the 20th century, early in the 20th century. Right, so the idea was unity. So Weiss establishes the institutional basis of reform in America. But with that Pittsburgh Platform of 1885, to some extent, Einhorn winds up winning, because classical reform becomes the basis of Reform Judaism. Yeah. Go ahead.
So this is a bit focusing on a different section of your presentation, and specifically this individual is commenting, and I wonder if you can speak to this, about the point that Michael Meyer makes regarding German reform, specifically that American reform in its radicalism went beyond the reforms of Germany, to the point where German reform was becoming more conservative, whereas American reform was becoming even more extreme. Can you speak to that argument?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And the essence of this is that, don't forget, Germany wasn't unified till 1870, 1871. Jews do not get real freedom in Germany, political rights in Germany until then. And Americans had experienced basic rights. I mean, it varied from colony to colony, but certainly going back to the colonial period in most of the colonies. So in America, and there's another thing, Germany had traditions of rabbis and orthodoxy and unified Jewish communities going back centuries, okay? In America, you didn't have that. You didn't have the ordained rabbis, you didn't have those traditions. You essentially had individual autonomy of individuals and of the congregations, and that's the way it remained. And I'll add one thing briefly to that. The first national organization we have is the, what is it? The Board of Delegates of American Israelites. This is established in around 1858, 1859 in response to the Mortara affair that takes place in Italy. American congregations were used to essentially doing their own thing. So they were protesting to Buchanan, the president at the time. Some of the congregations did it individually, some of the congregations did it together, but it was essentially haphazard. So this was one of the reasons for the establishment of the Board of Israel. Yeah, good. Come on, Mark. Yeah, the Board of Israel. Yeah, whatever that board was. The Board of Delegates of American Israelites. Excuse my senior moments. But that was, again, something that Har Sinai and KKBE rejected. It was a rabbinical authority. Next.
If you could speak to the role of the reform movement, perhaps outside of some of these urban centers. So a lot of the presentation was focused and the questions focused around different cities. Can you speak to some of the sort of the history and where there's similar patterns in terms of the reform movement outside of these major US southern cities?
Well, eventually, New York, you've got a Reform congregation in New York shortly after Baltimore, okay? And again, like Baltimore, it's not called the Temple, it's called the Brine to begin with. So that starts in New York, and then it takes off from there. As you know, Jews moved from the East Coast straight across the country especially with the gold rush. But as Americans moved westward and destroyed the Indians and everything else and pushed out the Spanish, Jews were part of that movement. And as they did so, they settled in small towns and small cities throughout the country. Okay. Wherever they could, they established first cemeteries usually, then usually schools run by the women for the kids, not really schools, just training for the kids, and then ultimately congregations. Many of the congregations start out as traditional, but they're usually established by people who have already been in America and have experienced life in different towns and cities before they went to Texas or Missouri or the Dakotas or California. So they're on the move towards secularization. So while many of the congregations have started as traditional, it's not unusual for them to become Reform rather quickly. And gradually what happens is some of them start out as Reform. I mentioned San Francisco. Galveston, Texas starts out as Reform. And that's basically the story of American congregational history, this movement westward and the creation of congregations as you go along.
So I think with that, I'm going to get us wrapped up for this afternoon. So I just want to say again, thank you, Mark, for such an interesting presentation. I also want to thank Abe, who did the intro for us this afternoon, and Trillian as well for providing tech and logistical support for today's program. So we're now going to be dropping a few links in to the chat. So I want to again draw everyone's attention to the program coming up on April 20th. If you're interested in exploring more of the history related to the Lloyd Street Synagogue, I'd really encourage you to register for the public offering of the digital tour of Discover the Lloyd Street Synagogue. So that link should be coming up for you in chat. We're also going to be dropping in 2 links for resources from the Southern Jewish Historical Society. So there'll be a bibliography of work that's published on the topic of Southern Jewish history, as well as a link where you can download previous volumes that are available of the journal. And I encourage you all to, if you're not familiar with this wonderful resource, to visit their website and see all that they have to offer. And finally, there's a link if you are interested in purchasing Mark's book, which is an expansive look of the study of Southern Jewish history. And finally, as we mentioned at the beginning of this program, the museum is reopening on a limited basis to members starting April 22nd. If you haven't had, thank you, Mark, for modeling your book. So if you haven't had a chance to visit the museum and see the Jews in Space exhibit and you're a member, you can check out the link in chat for reserving reservations and finding out more about that offering. So with that, once again, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Mark, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Bye.